Stop it, lady. May I call the first witness, please? Lord Peter Ware.
Almighty God,
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Lord Ware, can I ask you to give your full name to the inquiry, please?
I am Lord Peter Ware of Ballyholme.
Thank you. And Lord Ware, I think you have a witness statement in front of you, which
Yes.
you signed on the 23rd of January 2024.
That is correct.
I'm sorry, I was just going to ask, but first of all, whether or not you're content that that witness statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief.
I am content, yes.
Thank you. And we're going to move on to hear your evidence in just a moment, but I think you wanted to say something.
It's just very briefly, with the indulgence of the inquiry, as I suppose both a former executive member and also on a personal basis, I feel it is important before we move into the detailed evidence, I want to express my sorrow to all those who suffered in whatever way through the pandemic, and particularly to pass on my sympathy to the families of those who lost loved ones during the pandemic. I appreciate that the hurt will not be healed and that nothing that any of us can do can bring back those loved ones, but I hope that as a result of this inquiry, while I think we all hope and pray that there will never be a repeat of the pandemic, that hopefully perhaps it can lead to lessons learned that can mean that if we do ever find ourselves in that terrible situation again, that however we tackle it can be done in a better way to what has gone before.
Thank you. Lord Ware, can I begin then, please, by asking you a bit about your political career? I think it's correct that from 1998 until about 2022, you were a member of the Legislative Assembly in Northern Ireland. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
And I think that you were and you remain, in fact, a member of the Democratic Unionist Party. Is that correct?
That is also correct, yes.
And I think during that long career, you had many roles within the Legislative Assembly and within your party. And I think that those included that you sat on the Education Committee for some time. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct, yes.
And I think that you were Chief Whip for your party as well. Is that also correct?
That's correct. I think as a result of the various roles that I have, it probably gave me a little bit of insight that I was at a range of different levels within the Assembly, so saw perhaps a wide range of various aspects, shall we say, of the way that the Assembly operated.
All right. Well, I'm sure we'll come back to that in the course of your evidence. And I think it's right then that for a period between 2016 and 2017, you had a role as Education Minister in Northern Ireland before the power sharing arrangements were suspended. Is that right?
That is also correct, yes.
And then when they were restored, you came back to that role on the 11th of January 2020.
That is correct, and I served in that role then until June of 2022.
So across the course of your career, had you always had an interest in education?
I think it was something that I always had a level of passion. I feel that ensuring one of the best things that we can do as a society is to try to give better life chances to our children and young people. So it was always something, even before I took up a formal role, that I had a considerable level of interest in.
And in terms of the powers that you had as a Minister for Education in Northern Ireland, it's an accepted matter, isn't it? So does that mean within Northern Ireland that the Minister effectively has full powers in relation to all matters relating to education? Or is there a limit to that? Well,
I think there's a limitation, I suppose, maybe on two grounds. As subject matter, I suppose it may be helpful to the inquiry. Education in Northern Ireland the department would cover most of the issues that were there in other jurisdictions. I think the one very major distinction in terms of direct role is that other jurisdictions, education would also include third level education of further and higher education. That is within the Department of the Economy here. And I think that whenever we say that there is a full control. The nature of the power sharing arrangements and the checks and balances within Northern Ireland mean that anything that is done is much more subject to a duty to bring things to the executive and get executive approval. So there is perhaps much less of an opportunity that if a minister of any minister is so minded for them to go on a more of a, call it a solo run, or have a wider, more unlimited authority.
All right. Just coming back then to those matters that fall within the responsibility of the Department of Education, you've already made the point that it was limited to essentially education prior to university and college, correct? So up until the age of 18.
That is correct. It would cover most aspects of childcare, all elements of preschool education, primary and secondary education, and also youth services, and specifically also then special schools and special educational needs.
Yes. And I think it's also right, just in terms of comparison to other parts of the United Kingdom, that the Department of Education in Northern Ireland doesn't, for example, have a specific remit in relation to child protection, or a general remit. Any role that it has in child protection would be limited to the education sphere. Is that correct?
That would be correct. I think as regards issues around child protection and, for example, in terms of, broadly speaking, vulnerable children, that is principally within the remit of the Department of Health.
Yes. So just coming back then to the situation as you met it in January 2020, what you've said in your witness statement, and I don't think I need to take you back to it, is that it's your view that the suspension of power sharing arrangements between 2017 and 2020 did have some negative impacts, but that these effectively, and I'm summarising, shouldn't be overstated. Is that right?
That would be correct. Do you want me to expand?
Well, I was going to just ask you a little bit about that. First of all, I think you make the point in your statement that in terms of the Department of Education, it had been able to function without a minister being in place. Is that correct?
Yes. People may say that it may be able to function better without me being in place, but that may be a different issue. I think particularly within a suspension, there is an opportunity and a responsibility on government departments to carry on with the work that is ongoing. I think in particular for the Department of Education, because there are certain legal decisions that need to be taken at times, there is I suppose a necessity for the department to be a little bit more proactive than some of the other departments. So, for example, in the absence of a minister would take a decision on whether a particular school had to permanently close or a new school be opened by way of what they call a development proposal. In the absence of a minister, that would have been able to be carried out by the department itself through the permanent secretary. So I suppose it meant that some of the constraints that would maybe have been there on some of the departments weren't quite as acute as they would have been with regard to the Department of Education.
And so during the period of suspension, may we take it that there were no major policy issues, for example, or challenges like that the department faced that required a minister to be in position in order to deal
No,
with
I think the position across the board was that government departments were to carry on all their functions, to carry on where decisions need to be made. But I think from a policy point of view, the idea was that the departments would not initiate new policy or separate policy that might have been there before.
Yes, the question was, is it correct then, and should we proceed on the basis that the Department of Education didn't have any major policy challenges during the period of suspension that it wasn't able to deal with?
I think that would be accurate, yes.
The inquiry has heard evidence that in respect of the Department of Health, that wasn't the position, that there was a need for radical reform and that there were funding issues that meant that there were issues about not having a minister in place and that these played out during the response to the pandemic. Is that something that you take any issue with or would challenge?
No, I wouldn't challenge it. I think in my evidence I suggested that as regards the Department of Health, I think they focused in, whenever it came to the pandemic, that was very much the focus of their resources and actions. I think the absence of a minister meant that the process of reform was clearly slowed, or at least went to a full stop during that period. And probably the implications during the pandemic was that the department was less resilient to be able to deal with other issues whenever the pandemic hit. So in that sense, it was sort of a more indirect than an absolutely direct effect.
And so would you agree with the proposition that the response of the Department of Health after January 2020 to the pandemic was conditioned by the fact that there hadn't been that ability to reform during the period of suspension?
Clearly it was not something that was helpful. I suppose the only thing to put slightly in a level of context, that even if there had been an opportunity to reform, I think any form of health service reform is something that will be a very long process over quite a number of years. I suppose the only question is a little bit of a moot point, that had there been ministers in place, how far along the line would we have reached by 2020? But certainly there is nothing to which there was going to be an advantage to there not being ministers, if I can put it that way.
Wasn't there cross-party support for reform?
There was cross-party support, but I think there's a tendency to find that whether it's health service reform or any sort of reform, it is perhaps easier to get a cross-party support than when the rubber hits the roads of implementation. People can buy into the concept, for instance, of health service reform, but if that leads to then a hospital in their local area being shut, it's remarkable the extent to which that level of commitment then tends to dissipate.
The devil's in the detail.
It is indeed, in that regard.
But I think it's right. There was a programme for reform that had been drawn up off the back of the Bengoa report. And as we understand it, but maybe it's not right, that programme of reform was something which was agreed between ministers.
That is correct. I suppose, again, the only issue is that it would have been relatively sort of strategic in its nature and therefore broad budget. I think there would have been a certain level of difficulties whenever we moved into the detail of that.
All right. Another thing that you said in your witness statement, and this is at paragraph 6, and I hope I can fairly characterise it as scepticism on your part about the paper that had been drawn up on the 22nd, or certainly is dated the 22nd of January 2020, which was the paper that said that Northern Ireland was 18 months behind the other parts of the United Kingdom in terms of its sectorial ability to respond, and that was in the context of pandemic flu preparations.
Well, I would say a couple of things in relation to that. Firstly, I think dating certainly within the Department of Education from 2008, there was a major emergency response plan. There was in place, as I understand it, the Department of Health had responsibility, if you like, for any form of pandemic preparation. So there was no reason for that to be delayed. I suppose where my scepticism would have been is the extent to which within any jurisdiction you would have had ministers who would have been very hands-on in emergency preparation prior to that. I think most ministers will tend to find that a lot of their bandwidth is taken up by simply firefights of what is happening at that particular moment within their department, or indeed by way of looking at very big strategic issues that are in front of them that have to be dealt with, such as be it health reform or a cancer strategy. I think what I'm saying is I'm a little bit sceptical that had there simply been ministers in place, that a lot of time would have been spent on scenario planning of potential events that could happen into the future. But I would have expected that whatever work that was needed done on that should have been one that should have been done by officials in that regard. There may be others in terms of the detail of what preparation work was done who would be better placed to be able to give a more detailed response to that and maybe contradict what I've said.
But do you take any issue with the suggestion that certainly at the start of 2020 there were serious issues about contingency planning in Northern Ireland, and for example the fact that the arrangements hadn't been reviewed for over 20 years.
I wouldn't disagree with that. I wasn't particularly aware of that at the time, but there's nothing I could necessarily disagree with
I
that.
think you've foreseen my next question, which was to ask whether or not ministers were aware in those first months of 2020 that in fact these papers had been generated, or certainly communications were being generated, about some of the challenges that contingency planning was facing.
I wasn't aware of that. I think as there was a potential remit from the Department of Health and probably to some extent the Executive Office, there might have been more awareness of that, but certainly I wasn't aware of that within the Department of Education.
I just want to show you one of the documents just to perhaps illuminate some of the things that were being said, Lord Weir, and again to ask you about general awareness. If we could please go to INQ 000 205 712.
Yes, could you possibly slightly enlarge that?
Oh, sorry, yes, I would be helped by that as well. Thank you.
Okay.
Lord Weir, I think this document was in your, I know you had many papers to look at, but I think that this was in your bundle. And I think this is the document, so we can see at the start it sets out that civil contingencies hadn't been reviewed for over 20 years and lacked investment. And I think if we scroll down, and for example, thank you. I'm just going to pause there, Lord Weir. There's reference there to a futures report which the inquiry has seen that had made 85 recommendations for improving civil contingencies arrangements. That paper had been generated, I think, in autumn 2019. Again, was that something that you were aware of at the time, or did you know that that work had been done?
No, I wasn't aware of that at the time, and therefore didn't know whether that work had been done or not done.
Thank you. And if we could scroll up, please. Sorry, scroll down. To paragraph 7, perhaps. So, for example, just in terms of the paucity of staff, Lord Weir, we can see reference there to the Civil Contingencies branch in Northern Ireland only having 5 members of staff. And at paragraph 9, we can see some of the strategic issues that were regarded as being of concern. And there's reference to there being a compelling rationale for commissioning a strategic review at that time. And if we could please just look at page 5. Thank you. We can also see, Lord Weir, at this paragraph, this suggests that there's certainly a particular interest in also reviewing civil contingency arrangements in relation to the Republic of Ireland as well. And if we could carry on, please just look at paragraph 13. So we can see there that policies and procedures and processes are out of date and no longer fit for purpose. And please, if we may just go down a little bit again. We're getting to one of the points that I particularly wanted to ask you about, Lord Weir, and that the review that was proposed in February 2020 was also going to examine the role and responsibilities of the executive in relation to civil contingencies as well. So I think, can we assume then that in terms of this paper, that did you only see this paper for the first time when you were preparing for the inquiry?
Yes, that would have been correct.
And to the extent that this paper may suggest that civil contingency arrangements in Northern Ireland were in quite a powerless position, is that something that, I mean, would you have been aware of that at the time, or had an understanding as a minister that there might be serious challenges as of or in and around February 2020 in relation to that?
I think from the background in terms of civil contingency, no, I would not have been aware of it at that stage.
And would you have expected to know about that as someone who had responsibility for a very important, I know all departments are important, but education being obviously a department
Yeah,
of...
I assumed that whatever arrangements were there were potentially fit for purpose. Yeah, I think it's something that I think it would have been helpful if I had been made aware of, but I wasn't aware of at that stage.
And just, this is obviously timed, or the proposal that there be a review is in February 2020, when obviously government in Northern Ireland was beginning to respond to the oncoming pandemic. Again, would you have thought it important that ministers were aware that there were these challenges, or that policy was regarded as being, if one takes this at face value, deficient or not fit for purpose, that was something of some consequence or importance?
Certainly, I think with the benefit of hindsight, I think it would have been very helpful in that regard. But as I said, I wasn't aware of it at the time. But I'd agree with your proposition.
All right. I just want, again, and maybe as we move on in your evidence, there'll be a chance to explore this in greater detail. But one of the things, Lord Weir, that this paper was suggesting, or might be thought to suggest, was that there wasn't clarity around the role of the executive committee when it came to contingencies or emergencies. Is that something that you would recognise, or perhaps in hindsight something that you would recognise?
Well, no, I think in terms of the executive having overall responsibility for all non-devolved matters, which would have included civil contingency, I'm not quite clear where there would have been any particular lack of knowledge, or maybe lack of knowledge only, but any level of ambiguity as to what any role of the executive would be. So I'm not quite clear where the question mark about the role of the executive would be on that.
Well, it might be thought, and again we may come to this, for example, the civil contingencies group that the Northern Ireland Protocol civil contingencies foresees was supposed to be a decision-making part of the structure. And I think that, as the inquiry understands it, based on reports that were written during the course of the pandemic, there was a question mark as to whether that group could fulfil that role, and that effectively the executive committee became that decision-making body, but perhaps in a way not foreseen by the arrangements.
Well, I think that, again, maybe there's a differentiation that the role of any civil contingency group should be one which maybe deals with a range of operational matters and is an opportunity for coordination. Policy should always be set certainly in circumstances in which devolution has taken place, should always rest, I think, with the executive itself, because that is the properly democratic accountable body.
All right. Well, maybe as we move on, we can have a look at that in greater detail. But just turning back to your statement, and you deal at paragraph 14 with the timing of the civil contingencies arrangements and when they were stood up in Northern Ireland. And the inquiry knows that they were effectively stood up on the 18th of March. But prior to that date, who, in terms of ministerial understanding, who was driving the response to the pandemic up and until that point?
I think probably the distinction in terms of timing would have been pre-March and then from the beginning of March. The first main presentation that we received as an executive on the pandemic, or what became then the pandemic, I think was on the 2nd of March. I think from the point at which then that became clear, I think the executive really became the key decision-making body in that regard. Prior to that, internally, the Civil Contingencies Group, I understand, had met on the 20th of February, and there would have been a representative of my department, I think, at that meeting. In terms of the broader bit of who was dealing with the potential pandemic was largely within the Department of Health, and there probably wasn't a great deal of information or clarity up until really the end of February. It may well have been that as regards what was happening and maybe the level of data was quite a confused picture in the run-up to the beginning of March. And it wasn't necessarily clear whether we were facing a pandemic, whether this was a more severe just form of a flu infection, or whether, as had it happened on a couple of occasions before the past, it was a health scare which then didn't materialise into that. But the level of information, I suppose, that came to ministers other than health and possibly TEO was very, very limited, where any information that I was able to react to that did come my way, we took whatever precautions we could within the department on a few issues, but there was very, very little that was talked about.
I was just going to come, if I may, and deal with some of what you've said chronologically. Yep. And perhaps if we could look at INQ 000 176 129. And thank you. This was a memo that was sent to you, or a submission that was sent to you on the 13th of February. And I think if we just scroll down this, please. I think you were asked to give consent, which you duly went on to do, for there to be legislative provision made for the closure of schools. Is that correct?
That is correct. I felt it was important that while this was a precaution, and it was a precaution that I hope would never have to be put in place, that this was a very sensible route to ensure that if we needed to act at speed, that it could be done. The alternative in terms of legislation would have been to try to put something through the Assembly. But I suppose I was acutely aware that if we reached a point at which we had to respond very quickly to the issues around what was happening, that it couldn't be something which was delayed by having to go through particular procedures. And I suppose the very specificity as regards closure of schools, there was potentially a grey area that if you were looking to temporarily close a school as opposed to permanently close it, I think there was a little bit of a grey area as to who had direct power or legal responsibility. I felt it was important that we had, there was, if you like, that option that if something needed to be activated, that it could be done without levels of any delay and any potential damage. And I suppose the other thing I would say, just in relation to the issues that were before there, when we were talking about closures of schools, it was not necessarily envisaged. There was the possibility that they might have to close across the board. But by the fact that it was a clear-cut power to close schools, there may well have been a situation in which, because, for example, if there was an outbreak in a particular area, that what may needed to be done was closure in a particular area or of a particular school. So yes, it was felt. I felt it was, and I agreed with the submission that it was very important that was something that there was clear lines of preparedness and precaution. We didn't know at that stage whether this was going to develop into something, as it did, much more serious. But it was right that where something was flagged up, that a precautionary approach was taken.
And I think if we scroll up, please, or scroll down, we can see, and just a little bit more. Mm-hmm. Thank you, to the main, yes, thank you, it's the first paragraph. So effectively, this was a submission to you, notifying you that this power was required, and as we can see, it's set out at paragraph 2. This was specifically, obviously, because of COVID-19 at this time. So your officials were obviously making you aware, weren't they, in the middle of February, that it was a possibility that schools might need to be closed and that you needed a power to do it, correct?
Yes, and as I said, I think some of that was to ensure that there wasn't ambiguity about who had the power. Was it, for example, a situation in which the school principal decided to close, or a board of governors, or a managing authority? And I suppose there was also a feeling that if action needed to be taken, that we needed to have something which was clear and also consistent, so that there wasn't a situation where people in very similar circumstances took different decisions.
Yes. But I think obviously at this stage, officials in your department and you were already in the process of planning for the potential closure of schools. You understood that might happen.
I understood it was a possibility. It was something that I clearly didn't want to see happen, but I felt that it was the sensible precautionary thing to do to at least ensure that there was clarity around the power to do that, and a feeling that if that was something that's needed, it may be something that would have to be activated very, very quickly.
I wonder if we could look, please, and if I could ask to be brought up on screen, paragraph 9 of your witness statement.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And perhaps if we could just highlight the first part of paragraph 9, so maybe just on page 4. And I think what you say there, Lord Weir, is that prior to March, most of us looked on with some apprehension, albeit without much of an understanding of what was to come. In particular, there was no real anticipation of the scale or duration of what we would soon face. Any work in terms of preparation was largely being done by the Department of Health, and I do not recall any planning issues being raised to me by my department. Is that correct?
It's correct that I made that statement at the time. I think I'd forgotten about when I was making about the particular submission of and the action on the 13th of February. So it is perfectly correct, although not 100% accurate in that regard. I'd forgotten about that. And there were another couple of actions of a more minor nature that we were able to do in terms of preparation. But the broad point, I think, was that the vast majority of knowledge and involvement was really within the Department of Health, that this wasn't something that was largely brought, that permeated out amongst other ministers really until the beginning of March.
But you having agreed to legislation in the middle of February to empower you to close schools, were obviously quite clear, first of all, that that was in prospect and something that would, if it were going to happen, require a huge amount of planning and cooperation with other departments.
Well, I thought that it was something that was a possibility. It's not something that I envisaged happening at that stage, if I can put it that way.
So as far as you're concerned, in that period, in and around February, there was nothing that you needed to do as the Minister for Education in order to start the process of planning for the potential closure of schools?
I think from what I would say in relation to that, I think we were in a position that actions that if we needed to go to remote learning, that the department was in a fairly good, the structures, while there are many criticisms we made of the structures of education, that we would be in a position that if needs be, we could have moved towards that. I regarded this as a possibility and probably felt the more likely scenario was that there may well need to be intervention on a small group of individual group of schools. I didn't at that stage envisage that it was likely in any way that there would be a full shutdown of schools.
You've said, and I think it's also clear from your statement, if I can maybe put it in informal terms, but effectively that the Department of Health was in the driving seat. Is that a fair way of
I think that's the reason. I know that the Department of Health was working with colleagues from other jurisdictions within the UK and probably with the Republic of Ireland as well. But in terms of any work that was ongoing was largely done through the Department of Health. And I think there was, generally speaking, a broader context in which it wasn't quite clear where things were going to go, what the level of severity was going to be. And I suspect that outside of maybe a relatively small number of people in any jurisdiction, most people didn't anticipate or expect precisely what happened as regards to the pandemic.
There's no sense in the notes, for example, of the minutes or in communications of ministers clamouring for the civil contingency arrangements to be stood up at any stage in February or indeed for some time in March. Is that correct?
Yes, that would be correct. I think there was probably a view taken that that in terms of what was needed, that as the Department of Health was largely at the cold face, that certainly we would have been very supportive of any requests that had been made to take action. But from that perspective, I don't think there was a particular push on, and maybe there was an impression, certainly given by the Department of Health, that while there were problems potentially coming down the line, that there wasn't necessarily quite the same level of immediacy. And I think that was maybe one of the mistakes that was made during.
So when would you say, Lord Ware, that the perception of ministers changed and it was understood by them that, in fact, there was some urgency to this and Northern Ireland faced some very, very serious issues?
I think it became, I suppose, an evolving issue, particularly as March wore on. I think the first detailed presentation, but even then there was a level of uncertainty with that, came, I think, on the 2nd of March. Within that context, anything that could be done internally within the Department of Education started to ramp up during March on that basis. But I still think it was relatively unclear until very late in exactly what was going to happen and what the time frame was going to be. And I think probably I certainly got an impression from health that while we maybe faced a major problem, that perhaps the crunch moment was a little bit further down the line.
All right, so as Minister for Education, when did you start to plan, or when did you think there was a serious prospect that schools might actually have to close?
I think as things moved on into March, and obviously probably the pivotal point where it became a very strong possibility would have been in and around about the 12th of March, when there was action by the Republic of Ireland in terms of closing their schools. We weren't given any, while there was, generally speaking, at various stages of the pandemic, and generally there's always been fairly good communication. We weren't given, I think, until the announcement was made, and maybe because of whatever internal protocols they had, we weren't really given a heads up that that was going to happen. I think I learned about it effectively during a school visit on the 12th of March.
But just, I'm going to come to that and deal with that, but should the inquiry proceed on the basis that it was the closure of schools by the Republic of Ireland that meant that you gave serious contemplation to that being a realistic prospect in Northern Ireland?
Well, again, it was, I think that it was clearly an issue that was potentially on the agenda. It might have predated that by a little bit within that. Certainly the advice that was being given, I know we'll probably come on to this, was that this wasn't the appropriate time, and yes, there was concerns raised over what the impact within a wider context would be of school closures. I know we'll probably come to that as well. But I know in terms of the prospect of what would need to be done in terms of the potential pandemic, my officials were starting then to engage with stakeholders in the first half of March, and then stood up internal arrangements at about the middle of March, prior to the schools actually closing.
All right, we'll have a look at one of the plans that certainly the inquiry has seen about education in Northern Ireland, but just sticking with the 12th of March, we know, so two things happened on the 12th of March.
Yes. Obviously,
within the United Kingdom, there was a move, wasn't there, from contain to delay, yes?
Yes, I think that roughly would have been about that stage, yes.
And also the cessation of test and trace in Northern Ireland.
Yes.
And what you've said in your statement was that effectively that decision to cease testing and tracing in Northern Ireland was and I hope I put this fairly, Lord Weir, that was a matter for the Department of Health, effectively. That wasn't something that was a matter for ministers. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think as regards test and tracing, I don't have a perfect recall of when it happened, but I think that operationally was done, and probably a decision taken by the Department of Health. From memory of it, I don't think a prior approval was sought from the executive for that.
And did you understand that the decision that was made by the government and the United Kingdom government, that effectively decided the position for Northern Ireland? Or did you understand there to have been an independent decision in Northern Ireland about what it would do at that date?
Well, I think that Northern Ireland had independence to do what it felt to be the appropriate response in relation to that. I would assume that as there would been a close coordination across particularly very CMOs, CSA and health ministers, that whatever advice was being given within the UK centrally as to what the appropriate courses of action would be, that it was largely ones that were either decided on a UK-wide basis, but at least was being implemented on roughly speaking, at least people were following the same sort of advice. But I think the power to actually decide whether test and trace ended or stopped in Northern Ireland at that particular point, I think would have been taken by the Department of Health itself. It wasn't an absolute fait accompli that necessarily would be the case.
All right, but that wasn't the subject of ministerial consideration? Or
not to the best of my memory, I don't think.
Right.
I don't think it was.
Right. So staying then with an issue obviously that was particularly important to you, the decision by the Republic of Ireland to close schools. I think that led to a meeting, and I think we've got this at INQ 000 289 859. And if we could just scroll down, please. So I'll come back and ask you some questions about this, Lord Weir, but first of all, I think that we can see reference in the first paragraph to that leading potentially to some public confusion.
Yes.
And then in the second and I'll ask you about that. In the second paragraph, the Health Minister saying that the science continues to work for Northern Ireland and that approach ought to continue. Mm-hmm. And we see reference there to sage advice that school closures, when they're considered appropriate, would be for 15 weeks, but that was unlikely to have a significant impact. Mm-hmm. And then if we could go over the page, please. We see reference to the view that closing schools would collapse the healthcare system,
Yes.
render futile much planning work to date. He refers to an absence of spikes. I assume that's a reference to spikes in the infection rate. And then we can see that you agreed the impact of having 340,000 children not at school is immense. Many parents would be removed from providing frontline services. Childcare implications huge. And I think if we go to the very bottom, we can see reference to Mr. Baker there. Mm-hmm. Any decision would need to include primary and post-primary childcare implications huge for local economy. Biggest issue, impact on exams in consideration of those eligible for free school meals. Mm-hmm. So I think there are a number of questions that follow on from that. I think that we can see the issue or the question being asked, why had schools, in fact, in the Republic of Ireland closed? And why was the position different in Northern Ireland? Was there clarity at this stage as to why the Republic of Ireland had moved to do that?
I don't think they gave us particular clarity. They obviously had taken a sovereign decision that was the best course of action at that particular time. Obviously, our responsibility was to try and decide what was the most appropriate action in Northern Ireland. I think, as per the SAGE advice, I think at that stage there was at least acceptance that that it was quite likely that there may be some point at which it was appropriate to close schools. But both the advice that we were getting on that front was, first of all, that when it did happen, it would be for a lengthy, very lengthy period of time, which I think was accepted. So it was something that was a very serious decision, which had to be taken seriously. I think also from the SAGE point of view that there was a feeling that that level of impact on a positive point of view in terms of the transmission side of things would be fairly marginal. And obviously from an educational point of view, being in a situation in which however much alternative arrangements could be put in place, there was no doubt in my mind that there was going to be a very detrimental impact on the quality of provision that could be made and would in practice be able to be made for children and young people in terms of their life future. But the biggest single driver from my point of view, and I think the executive's point of view, was the professional advice and the overall assessment of the potential impact on the health service.
Yes, that's what I wanted to ask you about. So, first of all, first question, whether or not, for example, you spoke to a counterpart in the Republic of Ireland, in order to understand what the epidemiological basis was in the Republic of Ireland for closing schools.
I think, I can't remember the exact details of a conversation. I may on the 12th, once it had become clear, I might have had a conversation with my opposite number, Norma Foley, but I couldn't swear necessarily that was the case. There would have been contact from the department, and I suppose if there was information, it was on the basis that they were following whatever medical advice they had got from on their side of the border. But ultimately, if you like, the decision-making processes within the Republic, there maybe was some level of clarity could be given around that, but that was something that was ultimately internal to them. I didn't have access to any sort of form of information as regards that.
Yeah, I think that really the issue is what level of understanding was there on the part of you as Education Minister as to why the Republic of Ireland had taken that very significant step at that point.
I think there was probably a limited amount of direct understanding. I think it was probably as on the basis of that they felt that was the appropriate action, that things had reached a level of severity that action needed to be taken in the Republic.
Yes, I think assuming that it was on the basis of medical advice, I think it was really rather more the granular issue as to why.
I don't think that we got or received any particular granular information from the Republic as to why they'd taken that position.
All right. In terms of whether or not there were concerns about the infection rate having reached a certain level in the Republic of Ireland, or whether they had done work in relation to transmission related to schools or anything like that might have helped inform.
I think principally what was important at that stage was to try and draw from the best medical and scientific information that we had. In that sense, within Northern Ireland, and while at different stages in the pandemic, for example, some of the devolved institutions or devolved assemblies did a roughly similar approach as the UK government. I think the feeling was that we had to do whatever was in the best interests of Northern Ireland and most appropriate to our circumstances, which weren't always in sync with what happened in other jurisdictions. And I think ultimately we had to make a decision for ourselves. And certainly from my point of view, what I think was the principal driver, particularly at that point where there was still a high level of uncertainty as to what was happening, was it was very difficult to get past, here's the clear-cut medical and scientific advice as to what is appropriate at this particular time. Now, I think when the issue, we may come on to this, was then debated at the executive, it might have been the day after, I think one of the propositions was that as regards the issue of any level of restrictions or particularly as regards closure of schools, that we would follow and tie ourselves in with the best medical and scientific advice that we could get, rather than try to almost second guess that.
Yes, I am going to come and look at those notes. But I just wanted to pick up on another point that you've made, and which is also reflected in those notes, that the principal concern about closing schools was around the impact that it would have on the workforce.
Of the health service.
Yes. So was that the primary consideration at that point in time?
I think probably across. I mean, it was a situation in which, on the one hand, the medical and scientific advice was that this was not the appropriate time and would not be helpful on that basis. But undoubtedly, I was struck very much by the stark comments of the health minister, by I think it was something that a very similar approach was taken by the chief medical officer. And it was very clear that probably the biggest single worry at that point for the executive from a health point of view was reaching a point at which the health service was overwhelmed. That was probably the biggest single fear at that point. And it was fairly clear that there were two aspects to that. What was the level of transmission in terms of what the number of patients that were coming into hospital, and what was the capacity of the system to be able to help and support patients as they were coming in. And the point, I think, it was put very starkly, I think, in that minute by Minister Swan, that if this action was taken at that particular point, in those circumstances, that the health system could simply collapse, because if you were left with a situation of 250,000 children for whom arrangements would have to be made, largely speaking, they were at home, the number of staff that would take out of the system through whatever family arrangements were in place was going to have enormous impact on the ability to be able to provide staff to be able to deal with it. And irrespective of the numbers coming through the door, if there simply weren't enough staff to be able to cope and be able to provide that health and support, that was a potentially catastrophic situation.
And in terms of the potential catastrophic effect on children of closing schools, Mr. Baker, in that note, it reports him to have said that the biggest concerns were exams, and he referred also to free school meals. So at that point in time, were those regarded as the principal countervailing issues?
I think and obviously Mr. Baker can talk for himself. I think in terms of if you were ranking the pecking order, even within education, I wouldn't necessarily put those at the top of the agenda. I suspect that he may well have been saying, here is also something which hasn't been, here's another factor which hasn't been factored in terms of the broader, trying to highlight something where there would be an additional detriment. I think from an educational point of view, there was a realisation that whatever was done, that once you removed face-to-face teaching, that anything that replaced it was always going to be second best, that from an academic point of view, it would be damaging to children's education, that a situation in which children were at home all the time, that would have impacts in terms of the socialisation and social development of children. It would have major impacts in terms of mental health. There was a range of issues. I think it was fairly obvious to other people at that stage that if we moved to a situation in which schools had to close for a range of reasons, educationally, it was very detrimental. But again, probably the biggest single override at that stage was how would this impact on the health service and the ability to be able to deal with the coronavirus situation.
All right, I'm going to come back to the plans as they stood at that time, but just staying, if I may, on the decision. In fact, why don't we look at the plans first and then we'll go to the decision making. If we could go, please, to INQ 000086935, please. And please, if we, well, first of all, let's orientate ourselves in this document, Lord Weir. These are the sectorial resilience returns that each department had returned. Could I possibly ask that's made a little bit bigger?
Yes.
So, page 1, are you familiar with this document?
Well, I've seen it certainly as part of the papers, yes.
Just wanted to check. So we can see that it sets out key areas of concerns, issues, risks, potential impacts. And if we go to the one that was prepared in respect of schools, please, at page 30. So these are the issues that have been set out in respect of education. So we can see key area of concern, school closures, that the issue was absenteeism of staff and teachers. The risks were lack of staff to teach and support children. The potential impacts were disruption to curriculum, loss of nutritional loss in relation to school meals. The potential mitigations were larger class sizes and substitute teaching. And I think if we just scroll down, please. So there's an issue about annual intake and then school transfer tests. School events. Disruption of services offered by arm's length bodies. Loss of examination centres. If we could just carry on, please. I think that's all. I just want to make sure, because I don't want to be unfair, if we can just check the next box, please. Yes, thank you. So, Lord Weir, that's dated the same date as this meeting. This is a summary of the plans as it's been explained to the inquiry. The summaries of the plans that had been prepared for different departments. That plan doesn't reflect in any way the potential for schools actually closing. Rather, the risk appears to be its staff may be off, and that may cause us issues, and we have to mitigate in terms of having larger class sizes.
I think from that point of view, obviously it was drawn up by officials. I think that the prospect of schools closing, of being a very likely scenario, only started really to kick in around about that period, whenever action was taken in the Republic of Ireland. And also, I think it may well have been on the same day that SAGE made reference to what a length of closure would be. I think this was probably an attempt by officials to highlight here are some of the issues that potentially we were faced with. It was maybe felt a more likely scenario that the schools would carry on but be much more disrupted by the pandemic, that was seen perhaps at that point by some officials as being the more likely option.
So, I mean, that would certainly appear to be the case, but I think, again, just to be clear about this, I just want to make sure that you agree that certainly what the plans reflect at this time is an understanding, or would certainly suggest that the prospect of schools wasn't being regarded as something that realistically might happen certainly in the near future.
Well, no, I think,
look at this.
Again, I would probably make 2 points in relation to that. I think there's a difference between saying something that realistically might happen or something that was likely to happen. I think there may well have been, at least amongst officials, a belief that the most likely course of action was that schools would continue and there would be a level of disruption. I think across the board, I suspect that there were very few people, even at that point in March, who felt that the most likely scenario across the board was an overall lockdown and that we would go into the type of arrangements that we had to do. This was something that had not happened, in fact, didn't even really happen completely 100 years ago. So that was probably the case in relation to that. I think that the advice that we were being given in terms of from health, not only were they opposed, if you like, to the action being taken, but it was very clear that they felt if something of that nature had to happen, this was clearly not the appropriate time. So the feeling on it was that whatever decisions around schools were probably likely to be further down the line than when actually they did eventually kick in.
All right. I was going to go then to the political discussion about this issue, as you've already alluded to. I think it's right that decision by the Republic of Ireland on the 12th of March then prompted a need for a discussion about ministers as to whether that was a course that should be taken in Northern Ireland. And perhaps if we go to the handwritten notes in respect of this, this is at INQ 000 065 689. So, Lord Weir, can I say first of all about these notes? I think you have seen them, but obviously they're a handwritten note as opposed to a note that's been checked by the individuals who were present.
I should also, I'm not suggesting that necessarily in this note or any other it is the case. I think the other thing I noticed when looking through generally the handwritten notes was that maybe whoever was writing notes, occasionally there would have been a little bit of confusion on attributing comments to people, and possibly from the note taker, because there was a Department for Economy and Department of Education. I've seen at times various things that seem to be listed as DE, for example. That was maybe something that I said, but also whoever was taking the original notes may simply put DE when they were talking to the Department of Economy. So there is that slight caveat I would add to that.
Yes, I
that
think
point. I'm not
noticed
suggesting these necessarily are the case in this case, but it may be just appropriate to draw that to the attention of the...
No, you're certainly right, and it isn't off. Sometimes it's not easy to tell. I think what's a comment by you and what's a comment by Minister Dodds.
Yes.
I think I've looked for comments about education on the basis that they're probably you, but that may not be perfect.
That I think is quite likely.
So again, in terms of date and time, Lord Weir, we can see this is it. This is a meeting of the 16th of March in the morning. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to go through all of this. I think if we just scan down, please, we can see the reference to there having, I think a meeting at that point was proposed with the Irish government. Mm-hmm. And the Minister for Health was setting out the position, so we can see, for example, he's informing the Executive Committee that there weren't enough ventilators in Northern Ireland. So I think filling you in on the operational picture at that point in time. And if we could go, please, to page 10. And I was just going to pick it up. I think DOJ is Department of Justice. So this would be Minister Long. And if we could just scroll down a little, I think we can see her saying closing schools not necessarily right, but some schools closing. Executive always seems to be reacting, not leading, in reference to young people and exams. I think we can see a few lines down, she's talking about people taking responsibility. And if we may please go to the next page. Sorry, Lord Weir, I'm doing this so that I can put your comments then in context. And I think, thank you, I think this DOF is Department of Finance. Mm-hmm. So the Minister for Finance was setting out, if we could just carry on. So he refers to a growing lack of confidence in Great Britain approach. Civil contingencies understand medical advice, but also community concerns. We have different views on how to handle this. We all want the best outcome. The First Minister says not be out shouting. And then I think this is you, if we scroll down, please. CMO, highly respected, appalling way to treat colleagues. Don't shout me down. Challenge your view. And then I think if we carry on, row back, mixed message. I'm going to ask you about mixed messages. Discussion not needed in front of the media. People are anxious, afraid, following CMO advice. And I think if we just, again, have to be honest about schools, it's not, I think you were making the point, it's not closure for 2 weeks, it would have to be 15 weeks.
Yeah.
So I apologise, I am guilty of cherry picking bits from these notes, but I think that it's important to try and understand the kind of discussion that was taking place at that meeting, and to ask you whether it would be right to characterise the discussion about schools as having, and I don't want to be too blunt in this, but effectively to have become politicised, in that some ministers were of the view that the decision ought to follow, or certainly that there ought to be consideration given to closing schools because it had been done in the Republic of Ireland. I think was, but also because that had consequences, because it was leading to confusion on the part of the public. Is that right?
I would say two things in relation to that. Yes, I think it did create a level of division within the executive. I took the view that we should be following the medical advice and the science. I think that particularly ministers, particularly Sinn Féin ministers and the SDLP minister, first of all looked to see things at least with one eye towards what was happening in the Republic, and that if you like, Ireland as a whole should take a view. And that was part of a political or constitutional point of view. I suspect there was probably also a little bit of an element that there would have been maybe a particular level of antipathy for those ministers in that party towards the UK government, possibly particularly a Johnson-led, a Conservative government. So it was, if you like, a situation where not only did they want to follow the Republic, but they had a natural inclination not to sort of follow what was happening from London. I think the issue around confusion was twofold. The position, I suppose, was that it is natural within Northern Ireland that amongst the public, some people will look, even just during the pandemic, to what is happening in London, what is happening in Edinburgh. There are others who will look and wonder, why are we not following the lead of whatever is happening in Dublin? And I think the fact that there was a different position between, at that stage, then the UK as a whole and the Republic of Ireland did mean that there were some people who would be more naturally inclined to look toward what was happening in the Republic. To some extent, we're saying, well, why aren't we simply following what the Republic? So it created that level of division. I think the other bit about public messaging, which was confusing, was at kind of the exact chronology in terms of dates, but at one of the earlier meetings, whenever it was made very clear from the Chief Medical Officer and the Health Department that this was the wrong time to close schools, that it would have a very detrimental impact on our... But I think that there was ultimately there was agreement by the executive that that was the course of action. Everybody, in one sense, was signed up to it, albeit that I suspect the Deputy First Minister and others were much more reluctant to go down that route. I think the problem from the public messaging point of view was, having agreed to that position, I think within 24 hours of that, the Deputy First Minister did a press interview or a press conference where she said effectively, well, my position or our position is that actually it's the time schools should be closing. So effectively the executive was having a collective position, and then that position was to some extent then disagreed with in terms of giving her opinion of it by the Deputy First Minister. I think that is where there was a particular level of friction around communication.
Yes, I think we'll come back to that, because we do see other examples of that throughout the course.
No, it was not unique to that occasion, but probably particularly acute at that point.
Yes, and I'll come back and ask you about perhaps what might be described as some of the cultural issues around how the Executive Committee operated. But really just focusing on what happened at this meeting, and I was just going to pick it up, if I may, at page 37 of these notes. Okay. I think it's right, Lord Weir, that this was the first decision that the Executive Committee had been called upon to make in response to the pandemic at all. And we can see that, first of all, I think the vote on Connor's proposition, that's a reference to the Minister for Finance and his proposition that schools should close, or that there should be a plan to close schools. Is that right?
I can't remember the exact wording of the proposition, but it was effectively that we close schools.
So we can see that vote effectively divided into two halves, as it were.
Yes.
And I think that the Minister for Justice didn't vote, or had a different position from everyone else.
Yes.
Looking at that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the position of the DOJ Minister was that it was something that we were probably going to have to do but it wasn't necessarily exactly the right time to do it.
And then there was a second vote, wasn't
Yes.
there? And the second vote, if we can just scroll down, please. I think that vote is slightly further in the notes, but I think I can summarise. The vote was effectively... Oh, sorry, it is on that
It is
page.
not, yes.
It
I
is.
think it's proposed closed schools when CMO advises was the
Yes,
proposition.
and again, that appears to have divided along two lines, although there's a question mark. The note taker wasn't sure what the position of the Department of Justice was on that. Correct.
No, that is entirely correct. And I'm trying to remember from a timing point of view whether the second simply arose as a sort of a different route from the first, or whether there'd been, it may well have been alluded to in previous conversation that really what we should be doing was following the medical advice directly, and that was the appropriate bit to tie in with.
I mean, the idea that you would vote to close schools when the CMO advises might look like quite an odd thing to vote on.
I think the point, I suppose, that was getting made at that stage is that we should follow the medical and scientific advice, and perhaps it was to also to help indicate that while there was a reluctance to because of the detriment that would be there to close schools at all, that this wasn't a question of that if the medical advice was to close schools, that the view of those in the executive was not simply to say, well, no, actually, under all circumstances, schools will remain open in defiance of the medical officer. So I think it was important. We felt that in terms of a position, and the position of the executive should be that actually we follow what is in the best interests of the broader situation in dealing with coronavirus, which I think at that stage was to take that professional advice, and if the medical advice was this is something that had to happen at that particular time, that we would not stand in the way of that. We would support that and get behind that.
So you didn't think the decision whether or not to open or close schools was, for example, something that should be based on the best interests of children, or from what you're suggesting, your position was it was a matter for medical advice rather than...
That maybe slightly oversimplifying the situation. I think there was a recognition that any closure of schools was going to be detrimental to children, and that therefore it was something that, if it had to happen, would be done with extreme reluctance. But given where we were, given I think the high level of uncertainty that was there with the pandemic, that the overriding imperative at that stage was to ensure that we took, in the wider interests of Northern Ireland, the right approach in terms of dealing with the virus, and particularly dealing with the potential medical implications. That was for want of a better word, the trump card in any decision at that point.
Well, because obviously a decision to close schools encompasses a whole range of issues. Yes. In addition to it might be informed by medical advice. Yes. Correct, but it encompasses so many more considerations than simply
yes,
what medical
it would be. But I suppose
is.
if someone is putting a particular proposition in relation to it, this is not a question, and particularly as it came in the midst of a meeting, it is not a question of we're putting almost a paper together with a proposition that runs to a full page with here are the pros and the cons, and here's the route that we do. I think it was a broad principle that I think there was, apart from anything else, to make it clear that if we were told that this is something that had to happen, that is something that would be accepted in the wider interests of Northern Ireland, even though I think there was an acknowledgement that any action, and probably to a lesser extent at different stages in the pandemic, any level of restrictions, if we were taking decisions which only had an obvious benefit and no downside, then a lot of questions would have been quite easy. But I suspect at various stages throughout the pandemic, almost any decision that we took had certain level of advantages but there was going to be a certain level of damage to society with whatever direction we went in, whatever decision we took at any stage.
Wasn't this approach making the CMO the person who would decide whether or not to close schools rather than you?
Look, you could put it that way. I felt that in light of the overall position, I felt that from a public policy point of view, to be at a point at which we were in any way going to go against the very clear-cut professional advice, particularly at a point where there was just a high level of uncertainty, I think would have been the wrong course of action, and therefore I think we needed a certain level of clarity, which said that if we reach a point at which the advice directly is that this is clear-cut to close schools, that we would accept that advice. It may be that from that perspective, the earlier proposition having been rejected, whether you argue that there was strictly speaking a necessity to put the second proposition, there's maybe an argument in relation to it. I suppose it was to try and clarify that this was not simply a situation where we were saying that various things shouldn't happen under any circumstances, that we were willing to follow medicine and the science and take the wider interests of Northern Ireland as a whole.
There might be a question, if one looks at the notes of this meeting, as to how well served children in Northern Ireland were by the position that was being taken by the politicians. Can you see that when it came to whether or not to close schools, that it seems to have become a political and divisive issue rather than something that focused on what might be really profound?
No, look, I think it was a very profound bit, and I think it's a regret that it became that. I felt that we were getting very clear-cut advice, particularly from health, as to the course of action that needed to be taken. There had been a level of consensus on that, maybe albeit begrudgingly, a few days beforehand. I think it was others who wanted to take that in a different direction. And I suppose at various levels, it may be seen as being directly political, but I think that anybody in that position has got to make a judgment call as to what they believe in the best interests of Northern Ireland as a whole. Irrespective, that leaves them open to saying this is a political decision.
The position changed radically, didn't it, within 2 days in Northern Ireland?
Yes.
Because the Prime Minister announced, didn't he, on the 18th of March that schools would close.
Yes.
And Northern Ireland followed suit,
Yes.
didn't it? What changed in that 2-day period in Northern Ireland?
I think, I would say probably two main things. I think against a backdrop, we were seeing a rise in the speed of the pandemic may well, I think, from some of the health officials have taken them by surprise, I think, and I'm sure you will want to question them, that at that point of March, they saw a potential major problems that lay ahead being slightly further down the line. But I think there were two main issues. One, that the medical and scientific advice then became this is the right time to take this particular course of action, that indeed in the wider context we need to take every action possible, which led ultimately to a lockdown to be able to combat this. I think the other thing which made the wider context of a decision on schools and indeed wider lockdown possible was at that stage the UK as a whole and through the UK government committed to issues such as furlough, such as high levels of financial support. That made the choice that was there of a wider lockdown and with it the closure of schools something that was plausible.
But I just want to focus on the closure of schools. On the 16th of March, there's an absolutely definitive position that schools aren't closing in Northern Ireland, and it even goes to a vote that is not going to be the position. 2 days later, the Prime Minister announces that schools will close, and Northern Ireland follows. Had the epidemiological picture changed within those 2 days?
Well, I think from that point of view, that may be a question that is more directly in terms of some of the evidence that the likes of the CMO and others could answer to. What I would say is that the advice, and we had said that we would always follow the science and follow the medical advice, and the position of the medical advice in terms of what was appropriate changed at that stage, and it was felt that that was the appropriate time that action had to be taken. It is also the case, I think there is an interaction with wider lockdown, which was if we take an example that Northern Ireland had decided to close schools or whatever, and being simply an outrider, and we were trying to do this on our own, we know that there was not financially something which could support a wider lockdown within society, which would have meant in those circumstances that the responsibility for looking after children would have simply been thrown back entirely into the workforce and their parents, and in particular that would have created a level of disruption to the health service would have been enormous. I think the fact that there was furlough and a wider commitment, or at least furlough was clearly coming down the line, and a wider commitment to levels of finance, made that option something that was also practical and plausible.
Thank you. I think I'm going to stop you there. I apologise. I think we went past the time for
No, it's
work.
right.
I'm sorry, I
I
didn't
hope you're
notice.
warned, Lord. We have to take regular breaks. I'm sorry we haven't completed you before the break. I shall return at 25:02.
Thank you, my lady. Lord Ware, I just wanted to return then to where we left off, which was the decision the announcement by the Prime Minister on the 18th of March that schools should close. Was there any discussion amongst ministers about the closure of schools then on that date or at that time? Or again, was the Prime Minister's announcement that was the position effectively the decider for what was going to happen in Northern Ireland?
No, I think the decider was the fact that we were then getting clear advice from CMO, CSA, that from memory on Department of Health, that this was the appropriate time to take this particular action, and that there was a potential practical way forward, albeit lockdown came with a level of detriment. So from that point of view, it was more the fact that this was something that at that stage the judgment was it needed to be done in Northern Ireland, and it was doable at that stage.
And so are you saying that there was an independent decision by ministers that schools should close, and that it was informed by the position as it existed in Northern Ireland?
I think that is broadly the case. I think that the decision was taken at I think from memory on it, probably at an executive meeting around about that period.
The concern that's been expressed on behalf of bereaved people in Northern Ireland was effectively that politicians were seeing the pandemic through the lens of their political perspectives, as opposed to just focusing on the position in Northern Ireland and focusing on Northern Irish solutions, if I can put it in that way, to the pandemic. Do you accept that, Lord Ware?
I can understand why there is that perception, and I suppose over a 2-year period, if you're talking about a group of politicians, whether at times they will see things through a political lens, but I think everybody, even if there was a range of views, was trying to do what they felt to be in the best interest of Northern Ireland as a whole, and certainly as regards the actions, certainly from my own point of view, and others around about that 18th, 19th of March, was very much informed by what the overall medical evidence was. And if the medical evidence had been that this was the time to close schools in Northern Ireland, but it wasn't happening across the water, I would have gone along and supported that as well. Right.
I'm going to explore that with you and how the acceptance of medical evidence changed in the months after March. But I just want to focus, before we move on, to one of the issues that you've touched upon in your witness statement, and I understand you to accept, that insufficient regard was had, and I think particularly when it came to the first lockdown, to the impact that school closures would have on particularly vulnerable children in Northern Ireland. So first of all, can I ask, do you accept that?
I accept that that ultimately, I think, in the course of the pandemic, there was not enough cognizance given to the difficulties that were created for children, and very specifically for both vulnerable children and the vulnerable. At best, what we were trying to do, there was a range of actions that the department tried to do to mitigate the impact for vulnerable children, but at best it was an issue of mitigation. There was still going to be very major implications for that.
So can I just understand whether or not you're saying that there was insufficient appreciation at the outset, so in March 2020, as to the impact that school closures would have on children, or?
I think that there was I would say make 2 points. One, I think that as regards whether we had a lockdown or whether we didn't, I think circumstances had created a point where really there was no particular choice in the matter. I think there was a full collective understanding of what the overall impact would be. At that stage, there was perhaps a fear that this would be very detrimental to our children. I think the longer things went on and the more evidence ultimately we saw, and we're still seeing today, undoubtedly lockdown has had a major impact on our children to a detrimental extent. And I think the level of awareness and knowledge of that has grown over time.
Did it really require much thought, though, in March 2020 to understand that closing schools would be cataclysmic for some children in society in Northern Ireland?
I think that was something that was relatively apparent on that basis, and to some extent part of the problem that was there in terms of any handling with the pandemic. At times we were not making choices between a good choice and a bad choice, but between what was the lesser of two necessary evils.
But it's a question of planning, isn't it? I mean, if you understand that school closures might have a particularly detrimental effect on some children in society, then you can plan your mitigations around
there
that.
was able to be a range of mitigations put in place very quickly and effectively from day one in some aspects for vulnerable children. The point, I suppose, in terms of mitigations was it was reducing the gap to which there would be additional harm rather than being in a position to entirely overthrow that. So, for example, from day one, indeed, as part of the thing, schools themselves didn't completely close. They were face-to-face teaching was removed for the vast majority of pupils, but schools themselves stayed open for what was called supervised learning, and the children that were entitled to go along were those that were classified as being vulnerable children and those who were children of key workers. And that was something that was there from the very first day in which schools didn't operate. And there were a range of other actions throughout that, but all those things were just simply trying to reduce the level of harm. And I think that whenever you get harm on children of something of that nature, it is difficult to create a situation in which that it doesn't disproportionately impact on vulnerable children and the socially disadvantaged.
Just going back, though, to the points that were made at the outset of your evidence about contingency planning.
Yes.
Planning for the closure of schools would encompass a number of departments, wouldn't it?
Principally, most of there would have been various things that we had to do in education. We would have collaborated with other departments. Principally, a lot of the issues around school closures and the implications of that were principally something which there's a lot of it was internal to the Department of Education. I suppose beyond that, actually, we tried to work alongside what might be described as a range of stakeholders, whether that was school principals, trade union side. You know, there's a very wide range of stakeholders within education. So it was a combination of that, and obviously there would have been a level of around a range of things throughout the pandemic of interaction, particularly with health. On other occasions, some of the decisions that had to be made were particular levels of interaction with, say, the Department of Justice on some youth issues, or would have had a considerable level of follow-through, say, in the Department of Infrastructure when it came to transport issues.
Yes, I suppose I was thinking of something very obvious like vulnerable children or children at risk.
And vulnerable children, principally, as indicated, the department had the direct responsibility for the education of those children.
Yes.
Vulnerable children are largely speaking, from a departmental remit, are principally under the auspices of the Department of Health. But we tried to work from the start in an interagency basis with the Department of Health. We tried to provide a close working relationship with that. We were getting weekly reports from the Education Authority as to what action would be there. Indeed, in terms of, for example, the number of vulnerable children going directly at school, we were getting daily reports on that. We set up a lot of reporting mechanisms and met as a sort of a management team, effectively did a daily sit rep with the major people within that. So we tried to mitigate, but I think it was undoubtedly the case that with school closures and with the removal of face-to-face teaching, anything that was getting done for children, particularly vulnerable children, was going to be second best.
Yes,
there was no way around that, I don't think.
And was the position any different in Northern Ireland, I think, to other parts of the UK, that in fact vulnerable children weren't attending school in the numbers that had been?
The numbers, there was a problem, I think, across the UK. We found that in general, in Northern Ireland as a whole, the numbers, it was entirely open. Indeed, we encouraged anybody in that position to come into school for supervising. The numbers in Northern Ireland were very, very low throughout.
Yes.
Generally speaking, the numbers of vulnerable children were pretty low throughout the UK. It was probably particularly strong in Northern Ireland. Now, whether taking one level of positive, there were more family support mechanisms in Northern Ireland. It was maybe partly cultural in that regard. But I think in terms of trying to provide support and support for individual families, we tried to do that. What we couldn't do was effectively say to any family, any child, you must go into school.
Yes.
That is not so. I think we always tried to accommodate. We tried, for example, I think during periods of school breaks, to ensure that there was options as well for children in that position as well. But again, the take-up tended to be very, very low. And again, whether that was a broader cultural different response to Northern Ireland from elsewhere.
All right, but I think really just the point being that if one of the principal mitigations for vulnerable children was to provide them with school places, I think it quite quickly became apparent that that wasn't really affording the protection that had been hoped for children.
No, I think the problem on it was there was a range of things that were done, but there was clearly going to be a limitation on what could be done in a situation where you had a full lockdown and you didn't have schools operating on a normal basis.
Rodway, I'm going to move on, if I may,
Okay.
to deal with a different issue. It's one I touched upon a moment ago, which was the changing perception, I suppose, of medical and scientific advice that was being provided to the Executive Committee. And I wanted to pick up the chronology, if I may. And I hope to do this without having to go to too many documents, but if at any point you want to see a document,
No, that's okay.
Please do say to me. We've heard evidence, and we heard evidence from the Chief Scientific Advisor, that from July 2020 onwards in Northern Ireland, transmission rates started to go up, and that the picture remained a fairly consistent one throughout the autumn of 2020. Is that a position that you recognise or that you accept?
I think there were clearly, throughout the period, the second half of 2020, there were clearly ongoing problems. And it did seem that whatever interventions that were made seemed all to a limited amount of impact on the levels of transmission
Yes, I'm going to take you through some of the interventions that were put in place to ask you about them, but I just wanted to make sure before I started that you agreed with that general proposition that there was a consistent and steady growth in transmission from late summer or early autumn into the winter in Northern Ireland. And before we examine that, perhaps we could just go to your witness statement and look at what you say, please, at paragraph 74. So this is INQ 000 408 058. It's page 30. I think I would be helped if that could be made larger, please. Thank you. You say throughout the pandemic, the Health Minister was given overwhelming support from his colleagues on the executive. The situation placed his department in a very powerful position, and generally, if Department of Health pushed for something, they got it. While I'm not suggesting that either the Health Minister's CMO or CSA had too much power, I did feel that the executive had little option but to agree with proposals that came from the DOH, the CMO or the CSA. In effect, if they put their foot down, they would ultimately get the executive to agree. Having had an opportunity to reflect on some of the minutes of the executive committee meetings, do you think that that accurately characterises the role that the CSA and the CMO played in decision-making in autumn 2020?
I think, broadly speaking, it is correct. Did that mean everything was absolutely followed to the letter? But it seemed to be ultimately, if a proposal was pushed by the Department of Health, there may well have been a lot of debate about that. There may well have been concerns raised about that. But that for the most part, ultimately the executive agreed with a particular proposition if it was put by it, and that it did put, I think circumstances meant that did mean that it put them in quite a powerful position as regards the progress of events.
Well, I mean, what you've said, I think you've gone rather further than that in your statement, haven't you? You've said, in effect, if they put their foot down,
yes,
they would ultimately get the executive to agree. Again, is that something that is that an accurate characterisation of how you perceived?
Look, I think generally speaking, we tried to move ahead with a level of consensus and reach an agreement. I think if there was a range of if we reached a situation in which there was a particular proposition that was put forward, either within an executive meeting or before an executive meeting, where health were in some form of conversation or trying to reach a consensus, and where there was a bit of give and take where you could reach agreement, yes, you would reach a consensus that way. In general, the position was, I think, ultimately that if the Department of Health said this is something we require this to be able to deal with the wider situation, that ultimately was something which basically prevailed. There may well have been some level of either counter arguments or queries raised in relation to it, but I think factually the case that 90 or 95% of the time that did happen showed that at least it may be a little bit generalised in terms of that, but I think
Yes.
it was overwhelmingly the case.
All right, well, perhaps we could examine that. Before we do, though, just focusing on schools, it's right, and perhaps you recollect this, I don't think I need to take you to it, but the chief medical officers of the United Kingdom supported the reopening of schools in September 2020, didn't they?
That's correct, and again, without going into the detail of this, there was a long process of action taken to enable schools to reopen that resulted, from my point of view, in bringing at different stages, three separate papers to the executive. All those papers were informed with discussions with Public Health Agency to ensure that they were content with what was being put forward at that stage, and a number of meetings, I think, with the CMO and CSA I felt it was important that we tried to build a consensus towards that. And it was, broadly speaking, a position, therefore, that was backed across the UK. But there was a lot of individual work. And I should say as well, because I think there can be a slightly false impression given, this wasn't a question of simply returning to what had been the position pre-March. It was on the basis of what we called a new normal, which meant that when we did return, there was a wide range of mitigations and ongoing work with the PHA to try and make sure that education on a face-to-face basis could be delivered and delivered in a safe way. And while there was always some impact on transmissions by having schools there, which minimised perhaps the impact on wider society as well.
Yes. And I think it's also right, I'm just focusing on the same period of time, that, for example, the advice that was provided by the CMO and the CSA, for example, about whether or not pubs should reopen, because they were due to open in August, the position that they took was also informed by, I think, the reopening of schools and the need to keep schools reopened, to make sure that that happened.
Yes.
And that schools
I think there was a, broadly speaking, by that stage, there was, I think, both from the CMO and CSA, and also, I think, from the wider executive, I think there was acceptance that if something had to be prioritised in terms of what we could do in relation to the ensuring that children had the fullest possible education by having schools open, was effectively the top priority. I think that was, largely speaking, something that was common across the executive.
I think that that's right, and it seems to be reflected in a number of papers that they provided, that on a number of occasions they looked at it through the lens of, if you want to keep schools open, these are the things that may have to remain, may have to close or may have to remain closed, correct?
I think that's undoubtedly the case, yes.
So in other words, they were supportive of the priority, of your priority in terms of keeping schools open as events moved into the autumn of 2020?
Yes, I mean, I think it was both my priority and also, to be fair, it was a priority then that was shared in a wider sense by both the executive and I think to be fair, probably most people in society took a view that the schools should be the first priority.
Yes. And I think, again, I'm hoping not to have to go to too many documents to demonstrate this, but when infection rates began to rise in September 2020, and that coincided with schools having been reopened, that the decision was taken by the Executive Committee to have some localised restrictions, correct?
That's correct, yes.
And that reflected that there were particularly high areas of transmission in some specific areas, yes?
Yes, I think whatever broader issues there were with modelling, we were by that stage getting quite detailed, granular data as to the extent of infections within, I think, could basically be drawn down into postcode areas on that basis. And I suppose the executive as a whole, which was one that was supported across the piece, was trying to provide a relatively nuanced approach and trying to... The nature of things back in March had been that really the only action that we would take was a very broad brush, blunt instrument of a lockdown. I think as time moved on and we saw also some of the disadvantages that occurred from lockdown, I think there was a feeling that what we needed to do was that we could refine what had to be done into a more, call it, nuanced position. And I think the localised restrictions were to say, here's a particular hotspot, we need to be tougher on that than we are in the rest of Northern Ireland, or that developed to a point where I think there was any number of places across Northern Ireland where there needed to be a sort of a flexibility to say, actually, we're going to have tougher restrictions on where there's the greatest problems.
And what the CSA has said is that didn't work as effectively as would have been hoped, and that transmission, I think, to be accurate about it, he said that transmission was impacted a bit by them, but that it didn't have the outcome that was hoped.
No, I think part of the problem that we really faced in the autumn across the board, there was a range of interventions, and I suspect ultimately with a lot of those interventions, it didn't have the desired effect or what we had hoped would be the action. And I think probably the principal driver in that was as time moved on, there was considerable issues around probably behavioural approaches from people, and I think there was a constant fraying at the issue of compliance on that basis. I think back in March, people first of all were prepared to put up with things for a little bit of time. It wasn't, but each time we did this, there was diminishing returns, and that I think society as a whole in March was very uncertain about what was going to be happening, and frankly was quite scared. And where people are scared, having a level of compliance is probably a lot easier. Getting a level of compliance as time moved on became increasingly, sadly, increasingly difficult on that regard.
If I may just ask you to pause there on the issue of compliance. There certainly appears from the Executive Committee meetings to have been a level of frustration, I hope I don't put that unfairly, as in relation to whether or not the police were doing as robust a job as they might have done in Northern Ireland in respect of compliance. Is that, again, something that you recognise, or was that a concern that the Executive Committee had in autumn?
Yes, I think it was a concern. Look, it's maybe difficult to know precisely how much more they could have done, but I think, and whether it was a question of the police didn't want to be put in that position, I think from the Executive Committee, from the reports that we were getting back, we didn't get a great sense of the police being very enthusiastic to be quite heavy-handed, or more heavy-handed as regards compliance.
And was there an understanding on the part of the Executive Committee that there might be, that for example, the reasons for that might include the fact that winning the trust of communities in Northern Ireland had been harder than in other parts of the United Kingdom, that there were sensitivities around policing that might not apply in other parts of the
I think there was probably an element. I don't think it was particularly. I don't remember at any stage it being particularly contrasted with other areas. I suspect the police felt that overall, if they were having to simply police compliance on COVID regulations, that in many ways that was putting them in a fairly invidious position in that regard. But the police are probably in a better position to speak for their rationale themselves.
Well, I think it would obviously have been an important part, wouldn't it, of the Executive Committees, or an important factor in decision making, whether or not better compliance could be achieved by other routes.
And I think there was, as time moved on, we saw trying to push for better compliance as an important part of the sort of the armoury in relation to that. And so there was, I think, some decisions taken to ratchet up, for instance, fines and connected. How much ultimately that made and I think simply to say we're going to impose everything on everybody, but actually if you simply defy this, there's no consequences for you, I think is not an appropriate situation. And I think there was probably, again, as time moved on, there was also, I think, amongst the public, a lot of frustration where they saw a situation that probably throughout the pandemic, the vast majority of people kept entirely to the rules and the spirit of the rules. But more and more people maybe weren't doing that, and there would be, I could understand, for example, if you were living in a street, you were maybe self-isolating, you maybe had a vulnerable relative, you were making sure, if you like, that you followed the letter of the law, and maybe somewhere further up that street was having a party with a lot of people in the house. And I think there was perhaps a feeling within society as well that there were maybe some people in society were, for want of a better word, letting the side down.
Yes. Okay, I'm going to come back to the issues of public confidence very shortly. But just in terms of, just staying with the chronology, if I may, Lord Weir, I think the position continued to deteriorate, didn't it?
Yes.
In September. And I do just want to bring something up on screen, because I think a question arose yesterday with the CSA as to whether such a paper had been written. This is INQ 000065631, please. Thank you. This is quite a detailed paper that was written. This is I think this was provided, yes it was. It was provided by the Department of Health and Minister Swan, and it followed on from the meeting, the SAGE meeting that took place on the 21st of September.
Yes.
And the recommendations that had been made by SAGE, or the menu of proposals that had been put forward. And I think if we could please go to page 1, paragraph 2. This paper sets out the concerns that were beginning to accrue at that point in September. And I think, so in other words, reference to hospital capacity there. And concerns about intensive care beds.
Mm-hmm.
And if we could go up to down to paragraph 4, please. And I think as well there's reference on page 4 to the SAGE advice that had been provided. So ministers were being told what SAGE was suggesting at that point. So setting out the menu that was available. And then I think those options were set out as well at page 7.
Mm-hmm.
Just to make good that point, Lord Weir, that this was all set out for ministers at that point in time. And if we could go, please, to page 9. Sorry, Lord Weir, I don't want to rush you through.
No,
this,
that's
but
okay.
These
That's
were the
fine.
options
Yes,
that were being set out. And if we could just look at paragraph 28. The Department of Health was setting out some of the other benefits that potentially might accrue from the options that were being presented, and then set out against the disadvantages at paragraph 29. So in terms of the approach that was being taken by the Department of Health, I think informed by the position of the CMO and the CSA, this sort of paper is fairly typical, isn't it, in terms of providing guidance as to the options that were available.
Yes.
And also setting out as well some of the counter consequences that would follow if any of those issues were to be, if any of those restrictions were to be taken up or followed, correct?
That's correct. I think as the course of the pandemic progressed, I think it probably did become more and more apparent to people that any decision of whatever nature, as I said, could have certain advantages, but came at a level of, and whether that was to have further restrictions or whether that was to open up, came at a certain level of cost, no matter what direction was done in. So yes, there was always, if you like, some level of counterbalancing on anything.
Yes, but in terms of the way advice was being presented to ministers, it wasn't saying you must, for example, do this, or it wasn't presented in a one-dimensional way to you, was it? It was being presented in a nuanced way, setting out to you these.
I think that is true. I think that is largely true up to a point, but I think sometimes when it came to the executive, it wasn't saying you must do this, but I think it was made very clear what the view of health was. And maybe if I can paraphrase, you got the impression that was, well, you can defy this, but on your own heads be it, you're going to create a major problem if you don't go down this route of health. So it's probably a little bit, maybe not quite saying this is what you have to do, but I don't think it was entirely as open-ended to here's a range of options, we're just leaving you freely to pick where you feel pick and choose where you regard to be the best options, or if you want to do them or you don't want to do them, that's fine, type of thing.
All right, well, let's maybe look at that in terms of what happened after this point. We know that there was an executive committee meeting on the 8th of October.
Yes.
You might remember that. that was a meeting at which the Chief Medical Officer in Northern Ireland said that he had never been more worried
Yes.
than the position that had been reached at that point in time. I mean, one assumes from the way that meeting is minuted, I won't take you to it, that what was being conveyed at that point in time by the Department of Health and by the CMO was that things had reached a very serious point, and that there were real concerns that health services in Northern Ireland wouldn't be able to cope,
Yes.
and wouldn't be able to cope within a matter of days. Yes?
Yeah, I can't remember the specifics, but that sounds an accurate assumption.
All right. And the inquiry has already seen, I won't take you to it, but a meeting that took place with the CMO, the First Minister and the Deputy Minister on the 11th of October, when again that was the message being conveyed, that they were extremely concerned that the point was about to be reached where health services would be overwhelmed.
Yes.
And was that accepted by ministers, that was the position, or was there scepticism that the position had gotten that bad?
I think there was broad acceptance that there were considerable difficulties. I think it is probably the case that, again, the further we moved into the pandemic, there was a little bit more of a caveat put around some of the modelling. Because I think what was accepted entirely at face value in March, for a range of reasons, maybe didn't instill quite the same confidence as time moved on.
All right. I'm not going to take you to this. I'm just going to ask you about a paper that was written on it was a Department of Health paper of the 13th of October, 2020. And what's set out in that paper, it's at paragraph 11, modelling from a range of UK groups suggests that full lockdowns as before, with schools open, would result in a rate of a little less than 1. Full lockdown and schools closed and the hospitality sector open would result in a value of a little less than 1 and possibly greater than 1. So again, just coming back to the advice that was being provided at that time, it appears that what the Department of Health was saying is that there is a way of keeping schools open, but the consequences may be that we have to close down other parts of
I think, broadly speaking, that was
commerce.
the health position, yes.
And it said, and this was at paragraph 15, it says, current data shows that COVID cases in Northern Ireland are significantly higher than Wales, Scotland, England or the Republic of Ireland, even allowing for somewhat higher testing in Northern Ireland. The 14-day cases for Northern Ireland are higher than any other country in Europe, with the possible exception of the Czech Republic. There is therefore a need for stronger intervention in Northern Ireland than in other countries. Again, can I ask whether or not it was understood by ministers that that was the position as at 13th of October, that Northern Ireland wasn't just doing badly compared to the UK, that it was doing badly as compared to everywhere else in the continent of Europe?
I can't remember whether it was understood to that stark an extent. It was clearly, I think, understood that we were in a very difficult situation. I don't particularly recall whether specifically the sort of we are close to being the worst in Europe was particularly emphasised on that basis, but I think it was clearly, I think it was indicated that there was a very difficult situation that we were in, and that action needed to be taken to try and reduce the pressures that were there.
And I think the advice was at that time, wasn't it, from the Department of Health, that there should be a 6-week, effectively a lockdown, save that schools could remain open. Is that correct?
It may well have been the case, yes.
But I think, and we've already seen this, I'm not going to go to it, that recommendation, I think it was in and around the 13th of October, wasn't accepted by ministers, and that instead there was a decision to have a 4-week lockdown, but again, with schools open, albeit with a longer half-term break. Is that
I think that in terms of the decision, the option of taking... Look, I think by that stage there was also some level of recognition of the costs of lockdown as well. I think a 4-week was agreed at least on a precautionary basis, because there was always the option that if things didn't work out within that period, there was always an option to look at what could go beyond that. But I think there was also an attempt to try and balance out. There was a lot of damage being done to various aspects of society by way of lockdown, by way of restrictions. So that ultimately was then a position which the executive as a whole was able to reach a consensus on, at least for that at that particular point.
But certainly in terms of any suggestion that ministers were effectively just giving the Department of Health what it wanted, in that instance we can see that the recommendation wasn't accepted, and I think effectively ministers came to a compromise position.
Well, I think, I think from that point of view, there will have been occasions whenever there was a level of compromise within that. So it was not, from that point of view, the Department of Health an absolute, but I think in general there was a position that if health pushed for something in general, there was an acceptance that needed to be done.
That 4-week period of restrictions fell to end on the 12th of November,
yes,
didn't it? And it was for that reason that the Executive Committee had to meet on the 9th of November,
yes,
to decide what to do and whether or not to continue the period of restrictions, correct?
That's correct, yes.
And again, it was the Department of Health recommendation that effectively the committee should grant the further 2 weeks and adopt the position that the Department of Health had originally asked for, correct?
That's correct, yes.
And we can see, and perhaps if we just have the formal note in order to be able to follow it, it's INQ 000 004 8497. And this meeting had been preceded, hadn't it? I'm not going to take you to it, Lord Weir.
Okay. Yes.
But a paper that effectively set out the reasons why the period of lockdown was still required. Yes?
I think that's probably correct, yes.
On the 5th of November. And the reason was because the CMO, the CSA, and I think the Minister were not satisfied that the 4-week period of restrictions had had the effect that was hoped for.
Yes, I think that is correct. I think there was a broader complication that we tried to do various things and ultimately anything even by way of restrictions was not producing. We were getting a certain law of diminishing returns within that, and what I suppose might have worked well in March was not working as effectively on the same basis if it was attempted in October.
Yes.
November. Sorry.
So I don't think there was any suggestion that this 4-week period of restrictions had proved to be any sort of magic bullet.
No, I think there was.
The
the closest we came to that was, I think it was possibly the last week that had been monitored, suggested that there was an R rate of 0.7. As it turned out, and that was probably the latest data that we had, I suspect that ultimately that turned out to be a little bit of a blip, if you like, in terms of the way the figures went.
And again, just to come back to this point, the half-term for children had been extended by 2 weeks, but
no, it was extended. It was a 1 week that was extended to 2 weeks.
Sorry, yes.
Effectively.
But aside that, this wasn't a full lockdown that was being proposed. It remained the position that children would be able to go to school. Is that right?
That was correct. First of all, I think that it was not any sort of, certainly at that stage until we came really to the end of the year, there was no suggestion from health or anybody else that if you like the plug should be pulled on schools, that was seen as the high priority. I think we worked with health to see whether there was additional, whether there's, if you like, a contribution that schools could make, and as such, I didn't want, and I don't think it was pushed by health, that if we moved back to, even for a period of time, a full closure of schools, that would be a retrograde step, given some of the damage. There was a situation whereby at least there was an opportunity to avoid moving into that situation by way of an extra week's holiday. And I think the other factor as well is if it was going to be a very short-term intervention in schools, that was the better way of doing it. I think that the experience that we had in the spring was that schools were able to a greater or less extent, adapt to remote learning. But probably the most difficult choice would have been if they were having to chop and change between remote learning and face-to-face teaching. So it was seen, I think it was better to be in a situation where there was some, I think, additional school days could be put into that to make a contribution to the overall impact to try to reduce the transmission rates.
But just coming back to the position coming into the meeting on the 9th of November, as far as you're concerned, your priority that schools remained open, that was going to remain the position, correct?
It was, but I mean, I think that would have been my top priority, but that didn't mean in the broadest sense on either side of the equation I didn't have other concerns.
I'm going to ask you about those concerns in a moment, but as we can see, if we come please to paragraph 12 of this minute.
Yep.
So the first matter that arose was whether or not to grant or to accept that there should be a 2-week period of restrictions, albeit with schools open, correct?
It was the first matter which came to a vote. There was a considerable level of discussion and indeed an attempt to say, yes, there can be a level of acceptance. There will be a level of acceptance of this, but there was a concern that on a couple of aspects of what were proposed, that there wasn't a very strong evidential basis of potential good impact, if I can put it that way.
So what you were taking issue with was whether or not there was a proper basis for extending the measures by 2 weeks. Is that
No,
what
I
you're
think
saying?
I think that maybe doesn't give it the nuance that it deserves. There was an issue that if simply we were to roll over, there was probably two specifics. There was a very major concern. The Department of Economy had produced a paper showing that the impact on people's livelihoods, on the economy, was potentially devastating. They had estimated that there was a £400 million hit simply because of the 4 weeks, and that was a concern which needed to be weighed in the balance overall as well. And it isn't simply, sometimes that's presented as a, livelihoods against lives. I think it's not as straightforward as that. If you plunge society into much levels of poverty, then that has a very major impact in the long run in terms of health impacts. There was a concern that there was a willingness to accept the overall extension, but that in terms of, as you say, it wasn't a complete lockdown, so it was a matter of, there was a nuance of exactly where the regulations were going to be, what was permissible and what wasn't. And I think there was a feeling, at least, particularly articulated by the Economy Minister, that on two particular aspects, which probably in the grand scheme of things were not that enormous, that there wasn't a strong evidential basis for them to be closed or remain closed in that.
All right, so there's a legitimate debate to be had
Yes.
about the possible consequences of locking down
Yes.
based on the economic consequences
And
of
I think beyond that, there was that element of things, and I think part of the complication at that meeting was then that there was a push, at least by some ministers, to decide effectively to do the 2 weeks before you even looked at the paper that was being produced on the economy. I suppose myself and others felt that at the very least we should be in a position that we took all the evidence before we reached a decision. And I think particular to that, because there was never a proposition which says the 2 weeks should not happen. What there was to say there was a concern over a couple of aspects which we felt there wasn't a strong evidential basis for a level of shutdown, and we were looking effectively to slightly amend that 2 week shutdown.
So can you explain then if the issue was one about concern about whether or not sufficient regard had been taken to the economic consequences, why you were one of the people who supported this being decided on the basis of a cross-community vote?
Because I felt that first of all, I think a cross-community vote has been used frequently in different formats since 1998. It is something which is designed to try and ensure that whether it's the Assembly or whether it's the Executive, that simply you can't get a majority and just effectively ignore any minority voices. The purpose, I think, of the cross-community vote in this particular case was to say we want to reach a situation where there is acceptance of the two week period, that the vast bulk of the regulations are unchanged, but can we have a little bit of, there have been serious concerns raised here. We don't want to cut off this debate, which would effectively have occurred whenever the vote was proposed, and that actually we want to see these couple of aspects in which there isn't a particularly strong evidential basis, that there is some level of compromise to reach a consensus. If simply the vote went through, then that killed off any prospect of a consensus. And indeed, I think in the run-up to the vote, the Minister of Agriculture who proposed the vote had said, look, this is not the preferred route. This was a route of almost of last resort. We want to actually keep discussing this and reach a consensus and a compromise. But essentially, if people were saying, no, this has to be put to a vote, there should be no further discussion, then that was a device at least to keep open the debate so that we could try and reach a resolution to which everybody could at least sign up to. They wouldn't get everything they wanted, but at least that there was a greater level of balance.
Lord Weir, the cross-community vote doesn't exist, does it, just so that issues about which a minority of politicians feel strongly about can be, as it were, protected by the use of that vote, does it? It's called the cross-community vote for a reason. It exists to protect minority interests within the community, correct?
I would take in. I think this is where a difference between theory and practice. There has been common usage of either within the Assembly a petition of concern or the triggering of a cross-community vote as a level of protection, and it has been there since 1998 within the Assembly and with the Executive since 2007. And in practice, the way that it has been used has been to try to make sure that you don't reach a point at which simply a majority force something through against the wishes of a minority. So it was something that I think that there was caution before it was used, but there have been many numerous examples of it being used over the years. It is a procedural device in that regard, and the aim of it in this case was to try to reach a point at which simply we could reach a consensus, and it wasn't. I think getting at least a unity of purpose is something that the Executive should and was mostly striving for, to reach a situation in which instead of reaching a point at which there was simply a 6-4 vote in favour of something and that simply happened, I think there was a feeling with a little bit of a small amount of change we could reach a point at which everybody was willing to support, and we felt that that was a device to keep the debate alive and try to ensure that we reached a point at which there was that consensus.
I'm going to ask you about a number of aspects of that. Okay. I wanted to put to you what you said in your statement about it. You said that whilst it's preferable to reach consensus, particularly in a pandemic situation, I don't believe that cross-community voting should be excluded. That would have created the danger of one community or other simply being steamrollered over, with resultant resentment from that community. Mm-hmm. What community were you referring to in your witness statement? I was
probably making that in a more general point. The issue is that one of the values, there are many complications that are there with having a mandatory coalition of 5 parties across that. Possibly one of the advantages, at least, that we did have from that during the pandemic was that when a decision was taken and taken with a level of unity, the message was going out to the public that representatives from across the spectrum were in support of something. I think it meant that while there was a problem generally with compliance, that at least it increased the likelihood of people being observant of that and having a level of buy-in within that. If it reached a point at which it was clear that representatives of a particular section of our society were simply just getting ignored or outvoted, I think that diminished the opportunity to send out a message that as a whole Northern Ireland was on the same page.
Because there was only one community in Northern Ireland for the purposes of the pandemic. Do you agree with that?
I agree for everything. There's ultimately one. We are all a community of human beings, and whether that's the pandemic or anything else, I think, as I said, the purpose of cross-community vote was to try to make sure that, and in general, I think, is to try to make sure the decisions have got a wide buy-in. I think we reached a point probably at that point in November, it probably was a certain level of perfect storm, that probably the frustration with the fact that we weren't seeing entirely the success, the hopes that maybe had been there during the summer had been dashed, and that we weren't seeing the success, and almost no matter what we did, wasn't seeming to turn back the tide in terms of that. I think we reached simply a point where there had been a level of frustration and agitation across the board, possibly exacerbated, I think, on the occasion, sporadically within the executive, which didn't help the overall atmosphere. There had been at times leaks to the media. I think it was probably a little bit unfortunate that during the middle of that, I think there were 2 leaks went out in the middle of that meeting. That probably didn't help the atmosphere, and probably people got into a position across the board where people maybe entrenched themselves into positions more so than maybe at a different time they would have done. It was a kind of a build-up of tension in that regard.
So possibly at a point in time when decision-making was at its most knife-edge and sensitive and important for all people across Northern Ireland, people fell into these entrenched positions, correct?
Well, by entrenched position, I'm not necessarily saying that's a unionist or nationalist entrenched position. I think the tensions within the executive, because I think the position in terms of the approach that people took, ultimately there was a limited amount of difference across the board throughout the pandemic from the executive, but there was probably a spectrum of views. I think we ended up in a situation where that was the spectrum that hit on, and it was probably to some extent, to what extent are restrictions embraced, to what extent is the countervailing pressure of the detrimental impact, and people made a level of judgment call on where the exact balance should be struck. Maybe people came to slightly different views on where that balance should be, and I think at that point perhaps it, as I said, had we been moving from a situation in which there had been a much greater level of overall success in terms of the public health situation, perhaps those tensions wouldn't have been there to the same extent.
I'm not going to go to this, but in fact, the question of whether or not to extend restrictions, I think, by a week went to a vote as well, didn't it?
We eventually reached a point. I think there was possibly, if memory serves me right, ultimately there was 3 votes. There was different attempts to put forward different propositions. So a proposition that I think that effectively there be cognizance given to the economy paper wasn't supported by a majority of the executive. Eventually, what we did end up, that it did lead, it was not the most edifying period for the executive, but we did end up with a situation which was further than if you like, was nobody's perfect position, but we reached a point, I think, at the end of this process over a number of days, of a position which basically the executive was at least able to.
Sorry, I'm going to cut through this, Lord Weir, but
I understand that.
You were the person who proposed the second cross-community vote on the question of whether or not to extend the restrictions back.
And again, part of the issue was because I think we hadn't reached a consensus on that basis, and I think that there was a little bit of breathing space before we had to ultimately reach a decision, and I wanted to facilitate a scenario within which we were able to get something which everybody across the board could buy into.
And just to finish off on this issue, perhaps if we could look at if we could go back to the document at INQ 000048497. Page 3, in paragraph 13.
Mm-hmm.
It's right, Lord Weir, that the Minister of Justice is not a politician who's affiliated to a nationalist or unionist position, correct?
Yes, I mean, the issue, I think...
Sorry, I'm just going to
no,
finish.
she's in a party which doesn't designate as either unionist or nationalist.
So she recorded her deep concern about the use of a cross-community vote, which she believed would sectarianise the issue, be used as a veto to stop consensus from being achieved and exclude her from the voting process, and requested that further efforts be made to find consensus on the matter. That was before it went to the first cross-community vote.
And what we And from that point of view, first of all, we made it clear that it was not a preferred route to use that. To put this in a context which may not automatically, it is also the case that the Justice Minister and the Alliance Party, in a perfectly valid position, have largely speaking been hostile to the cross-community mechanism pretty much on any issue, because there's an argument from 1998 that those who don't designate are slightly relegated into reduced position. So this was something that was entirely consistent with a position that probably existed for more than 20 years. The central proposition, I think, of the Minister of Justice was that we needed to reach a point at which there was a level of consensus. And I think eventually, through a combination of proposals by the Minister of Justice and the Minister of the Economy, there was something which at least everybody was ultimately able to live with in that regard.
Lord Mayor, I'm just going to finish on this, if I may. Looking back at this, do you regret that decision-making about such an important issue in Northern Ireland at this particularly sensitive time ended up being decided in this manner and in a vote?
I think that it would have been much more preferable if we had not had that situation in the first place, and that I think the outcome which I always wanted to see was reaching a level of consensus. I think we were always a lot stronger when we had a broadly speaking agreed position, even if on a range of things it wasn't necessarily the first position of anyone.
Because although you've said that this was about keeping debate going and not closing out issues, the consequence of this kind of positioning by politicians in terms of public confidence in politicians is clearly, or must have been clear, an issue of potential concern and had the potential to do further damage to public adherence, for example, to restrictions.
Look, I think that being in a situation in which there was disagreement within the executive and a division in terms of votes is not one that's going to help fully public confidence on that regard, which was why achieving a consensus was the main thing. I think there were other aspects that happened in the political sphere earlier in the year which probably had a much greater level of impact on public confidence than the events of November.
Right, well, I think those are matters that we'll explore with other witnesses.
No, I understand that, but I think...
because there are other questions.
No, I understand that, yeah.
But I think, and in order to be even-handed about this, I think that the point that you would make is that the Deputy First Minister's attendance at the Story funeral you regard that as having had an impact on public confidence. I think in the same way as, and it may be less even from a unionist nationalist point of view, but from the basis that people look to what example is produced by those who are giving the laws, and if they see a level of divergence from that massively undermines. People come to conclusions sometimes. Is it one rule for them, meaning the political class? Rather, I'm not even necessarily saying in terms of direct political party. Is it another rule for the people? I think that was a much greater level of undermining the public confidence than what happened in November. But November was not. Those 2 or 3 days were a very difficult period, and they were not. They were not the brightest hour in the executive's handling of things. On that basis, it was something that I wish we'd reached a situation a lot quicker, and something again that we were able to reach a consensus on. It was something that I wish it hadn't developed the way that it had. Thank you, Lord Mayor. My lady, those are all my questions.
Thank you. Mr. Wilcock.
Lord Weir, I represent the Northern Irish COVID-bereaved Families for Justice.
Yes.
And the question I want to ask you relates to the Executive's dealings with care homes.
Yes.
So it's a different topic.
Yes.
The starting point of the question is your evidence this morning that the first major presentation to the Executive about COVID was on the 2nd of March.
Yes.
And in that context, I wonder whether I can ask for your witness statement INQ 000408058 to be put on screen and highlight paragraph 66, please. So this is the witness statement that you have been referring to this morning that you made for this inquiry in January of this year. Mm-hmm. And can you see, about 5 lines down in that paragraph, after you describe that although the executive was briefed and took a number of measures on the issue of the impact of COVID on care homes, you thought that, and I quote, "As an executive, we didn't pick up the extent and scale of the problem immediately, and the level of impact on care homes only really became apparent in a wider context to ministers when the mortality rate through COVID started to escalate and infections and deaths within care homes were seen to reach such a high percentage of the total." Can you see why some people might find it at best surprising and at worst quite shocking that the executive as a whole failed to pick up the extent and scale of the potential problem in care homes immediately at the outset of this pandemic, in spite of any briefings they received, and the fact that many people may think that the occupants of care homes were very obviously extremely vulnerable to what you were dealing with at
Look,
that time?
I think that there was a failing in relation to care homes. I think that the actions that needed to be taken in care homes was something that there was probably a level of trust at the start to simply say this is a Department of Health matter, that the operational stuff on the ground needed to be the case. And so there was perhaps, whenever I'm talking about briefings, probably in terms of time frame, there was a number of times when it was raised. It maybe wasn't immediately at the exact point of lockdown, but it was raised by a number of ministers, I think from April onwards, and was raised on a fairly consistent basis. The response that we quite often got from health was, well, this is being done or that is being done. We are issuing this new guidance. We are doing that on that basis. Where I think from the point of view of a reflection, I would say, was that certainly with the benefit of hindsight, the approach taken, and it maybe derives from the overall SAGE sequencing, was I think stage 3 was effectively try and reduce the overall level of transmission. Stage 4 was to particularly target measures at the vulnerable within our society, which clearly those in care homes would be. I think on reflection, that is one of the things I think that was got badly wrong, that there should have been more cognizance from day one. And if, heaven forbid, we find ourselves in a situation as that replicated, there should be a much more of a laser-like focus on care homes. Can I say at a considerable level of empathy with the very difficult position that people in care homes had, both from the point of view of the susceptibility to the virus and also the countervailing damage that was done to them because the amount of contact with the outside world had to be cut. Throughout COVID, I was the carer for my 91-year-old mother who had dementia. She was someone then throughout that, apart from myself and a couple of carers who were brought in, were really for maybe a year and a half, the only people physically in with her. I knew that if she wasn't isolated, that she was somebody that was going to be vulnerable and would be a high level of risk. But I also saw the flip side of the coin, which is why I have such great sympathy for any families left in that position, that for what turned out to be most of the last year and a half of her life, most of her friends and family were not able to be anywhere near her. And I could see that was having a detrimental effect on her in terms of loneliness and isolation. So in many ways, I think for the vulnerable in our society, care homes became and is something which is totemic of the wider problem and the wider dilemma that we had there. But if you're asking me if we were doing this again, I think that we should have, I think there should have been an action. I think there wasn't maybe there was an assumption that everything was getting sorted out. I think that there was not enough of a fast tracking with hindsight in terms of doing everything that possibly could, including, again, we probably made an assumption that if somebody was being released back into a care home from a hospital, that they were completely free of any virus. I think there probably wasn't enough checks in relation to it. Again, that was something I have to say on a personal basis I experienced because I think around about March or April time of the pandemic, my mother had a fall, ended up in hospital for a week. I was not able to see her for that week. She was able to be brought home. Thankfully, she didn't have the virus. But I think it is something which, as an executive, it may be difficult to pinpoint. I don't want to scapegoat individuals or anything of that nature. But collectively as society and collectively as an executive, we didn't get it right as regards care homes. I would certainly admit and agree that.
The executive failed care homes, in short, didn't it?
I think it didn't do the job that ultimately it should have done. Now, how much of that was absolutely apparent at the time, maybe question. I think there was probably a little bit of a barrier there in that initially it was something that in terms of the issues of PPE, issues of testing, were largely carried out very much on an operational basis by health, and there was probably a little bit of a time lag before we got the information on that. And there's maybe an argument that before there was a full realisation of the need to take action, that before we reached that point, there was maybe a certain element of missed opportunity. It was something that we kept on pressing health to it, and there were responses given from the Minister of Health in connection with that. But I think if you were doing this again, I think being in a situation where the most vulnerable of our society are actually put front and centre of any response to the pandemic would be the way I think it's one of the lessons collected in Ireland. I think it's probably not something that was unique to Northern Ireland, but I think it's a lesson that needs to be learned throughout this.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr Wilcock. Lord Weir, before I let you go, as far as the sense of urgency at the beginning,
Yes.
If the Department of Health had pressed for the stand-up of the civil contingency arrangements,
Yes.
forgive me, I hate acronyms, is it NICMA?
Yes, I think so.
Had there been a greater sense of urgency coming from the Department of Health, do you think that might have helped the other ministers around the executive table?
Look, I think if there had been a request to stand that up, I think first of all it would have been something that nobody had any problem with supporting. I think directly in terms of my own department's involvement, at the lesser stage, certainly I think it was my permanent secretary had gone along to the CCG meeting on the 20th of February. We were very happy to participate and contribute to that. I think we got until relatively close to the point at which lockdown occurred. I think that there was a realisation across the board, but particularly from health, that there was major problems coming. And I don't know, I mean, look, this may be something which you may need to probe with some of the health experts, whether the medical and scientific advice across the UK was seeing things in a slightly different time frame. I didn't, until relatively close to the point at which action was taken, see a great sense of immediacy and maybe that changed it slightly from the word urgency, that there were things that needed to be done with almost immediate effect. I think that came probably relatively late in the day.
The second question, as you may know, there were the inquiries discovered that there were, I don't know if the word complaint is right, but forgive me, but complaints by the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister about their lack of control during a national emergency. And I just wonder, given your experience of working in the executive and politics for such a long time, can you see any place for different structures to make sure that there is better control in a national emergency where people are losing lives?
Well, I would say two things. First of all, I think that the structures that we developed later on in the executive, through the executive task force, was probably a better structure than what we started off with. I think it is inevitable, and I can see certain advantages in having a lead department, because I think there's a bit of a danger that if two departments and nobody's quite clear who's leading, that there's a bit of a tendency that one thinks the other is going to do something and the other in relation to it. What I would say is I think the model of leading if I can use an analogy, should be as, call it, chairman of the board rather than CEO. It shouldn't be a situation that whoever is leading is essentially just giving orders to the other departments. I'm not saying that necessarily happened, but from the point of view of that, it's got to be done in a collegiate way and in the spirit of whoever is leading effectively being genuinely the first amongst equals.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your help. I can't guarantee I won't impose on you again because I do have a module dealing with children and young people, but I do understand the burdens it places on you, so I hope we won't have to call on you again.
Thank you.
Thank you for your help anyway.
Thank you, Milady.
Right, I shall adjourn now and return at 1:45.
All rise.